The suspicion began innocently enough. Rachel had started coming home later than usual, claiming she was staying late at work to finish a project. She worked in marketing for a small firm, and her hours had always been flexible. But recently, her late nights had become more frequent. Mark had brushed it off at first, convincing himself it was nothing. But then there were the phone calls she always took in private, the new clothes she'd purchased despite their tight budget, and the subtle but noticeable distance between them. One Friday evening, Mark decided to leave work early. He was tired from the week, but more than that, he had an unshakable feeling that something wasn't right. On his way home, he spotted Rachel's car parked outside a small cafe on the other side of town. It wasn't the cafe that caught his attention. It was the black sports car parked beside hers. Mark slowed his truck, pulling into a nearby lot where he had a clear view of the cafe. Through the window, he saw Rachel sitting at a table with a man in a crisp suit. The two of them were leaning in close, their heads nearly touching as they talked. Mark felt a jolt of anger and disbelief. He stared at them for what felt like an eternity, hoping for some innocent explanation. But when Rachel reached across the table to touch the man's hand, Mark's stomach sank. It wasn't just a business meeting. Mark waited until Rachel got home that evening before confronting her. She walked through the door, her smile faltering when she saw him standing in the living room, his arms crossed. "You're home early," she said, her tone casual but forced. "Yeah," Mark replied, his voice cold. "Thought I'd surprise you. Funny thing is, I saw you first." Rachel froze, her eyes widening. "What are you talking about?" "I saw you at the cafe," Mark said, his voice rising. "With him." "Who is he, Rachel?" Rachel's face went pale. "It's not what you think," she stammered. "Don't lie to me," Mark shouted, his anger bubbling to the surface. "I saw you holding his hand. Is this why you've been coming home late? Because of him?" "It's not like that," Rachel insisted. "He's a client, Mark. We were discussing business." "Business?" Mark laughed bitterly. "Since when does business involve holding hands?" Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand." "You're right," Mark snapped. "I don't understand. I don't understand how the woman I've been married to for 10 years could do this to me." The argument escalated quickly, their voices carrying through the quiet neighborhood. Rachel begged Mark to listen, to let her explain, but he was too angry to hear her. "You've been lying to me," Mark said, his voice trembling. "All this time, and you've been sneaking around behind my back." "Mark, please." "Don't," he interrupted. "Don't you dare say another word." The shouting drew the attention of the neighbors, and before long, there was a knock at the door. Mark opened it to find a pair of police officers standing on the porch. "Sir, we received a report of a domestic disturbance," one of them said. Mark stepped aside, motioning to Rachel. "You can ask her what's going on." Rachel looked mortified as the officers entered the house. After speaking to both of them and ensuring there was no physical altercation, the police left with a warning to keep the noise down. That night, Mark slept on the couch. Rachel stayed upstairs, her soft sobs audible even through the closed door. Mark stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He had always thought of Rachel as his partner, his confidant, the one person he could trust above all else. But now, that trust was shattered. He couldn't stay in this limbo forever. He needed to know the truth, and he needed to decide what to do next. Mark awoke on the couch, his body stiff from the restless night. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards upstairs. He stared at the ceiling, the events of the previous night replaying in his mind. The image of Rachel in the cafe with that stranger was burned into his memory. He had wanted to believe her excuses, but the look on her face when he confronted her told him everything he needed to know. She was lying. He needed answers. When Mark entered the kitchen, Rachel was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. She looked exhausted, her eyes puffy and red. "We need to talk," she said softly. Mark sat across from her, his arms crossed. "Start talking, then." Rachel took a deep breath. "His name is Eric. He's a client, Mark. I wasn't lying about that." Mark's eyes narrowed. "A client? Is that what you're calling him?" "Because I didn't see much business going on at that cafe." "It started as business," Rachel said quickly. "But Things got complicated. Complicated, Mark repeated, his voice bitter. That's a hell of a way to put it. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, tears welling up in her eyes. I made a mistake. I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for it. Mark stared at her, his chest tight. He wanted to scream, to demand why she had done this to him, but the words wouldn't come. How long? He asked instead, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel hesitated, then looked down at her coffee cup. A few months. Mark felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. A few months? So, every time you told me you were working late, you were with him? Rachel nodded, her tears spilling over. Mark stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I can't do this right now, he said, leaving the kitchen. Later that day, Mark made up his mind. He needed to know everything. He couldn't rely on Rachel to tell him the whole truth, so he decided to find it himself. Using her phone while she was in the shower, he scrolled through her messages. There was a thread with someone named E that confirmed his worst fears. Eric, last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. Rachel, me too. I wish things weren't so complicated. Eric, we'll figure it out. You deserve to be happy. Mark clenched his jaw, his hands shaking as he scrolled further. The texts painted a clear picture of their relationship. This wasn't a fling. It was emotional, personal, and deep. But it wasn't just the text that infuriated him. Mark found photos, too. Rachel smiling in Eric's car, her hand on his arm. A selfie of the two of them at a bar Mark had never been to. He set the phone down, his blood boiling. This wasn't a mistake. This was a betrayal that had been cultivated over months. That evening, Mark confronted Rachel again. He didn't let her speak first. I went through your phone, he said, tossing it on the table. I saw the messages. The pictures. Don't bother lying anymore. Rachel's face crumpled. Mark, You what? He snapped. You're sorry? You didn't mean for it to happen? Save it. I've heard enough. She broke down, sobbing into her hands. I didn't want to hurt you. Well, congratulations, Mark said bitterly. You failed. You've destroyed everything, Rachel. Everything we built. I don't know what to say, she whispered. There's nothing you can say, Mark replied coldly. Word of the fight began spreading through the neighborhood. The police visit from the previous night had sparked curiosity, and neighbors began asking questions. Mark could feel the whispers as he walked to his truck or worked in the yard. People stared a little too long, their polite smiles tinged with curiosity. Rachel, meanwhile, became more reclusive. She stopped chatting with the neighbors, avoiding eye contact whenever she left the house. Mark wasn't sure if the gossip bothered her, or if she was simply ashamed. Either way, he didn't care. One night, Mark came home from work to find Rachel sitting in the living room, a packed suitcase by her side. I think it's best if I stay with my sister for a while, she said quietly. Mark stared at her for a long moment. Running away, huh? That's what you do when things get hard. I'm trying to give you space, Rachel said. Mark laughed bitterly. Space? You gave yourself plenty of space when you were sneaking around with him. She flinched but didn't respond. Go, Mark said finally. And don't expect me to be here when you decide to come back. Rachel picked up her suitcase, tears streaming down her face, and walked out the door. Mark sat alone in the living room, the silence deafening. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. Mark spent the days after Rachel's departure in a haze of anger and despair. The house, once filled with life and laughter, now felt cold and empty. Everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of the life they had shared. The framed photos on the wall, the coffee mugs they'd picked out together, the couch where they'd spent lazy Sundays watching movies. But all of it felt hollow now. The betrayal had cut deep, and Mark couldn't let it go. Rachel's infidelity wasn't just an insult to their marriage. It was an attack on his very identity. He had trusted her, sacrificed for her, and built a life with her, only to be cast aside for a man who had swooped in with a flashy car and empty promises. Mark's sadness began to morph into something else, determination. He wasn't going to let Rachel walk away unscathed. Mark began to investigate Eric. The man who had invaded his life couldn't remain an enigma. Using Rachel's phone and some digging on social media, Mark quickly pieced together a profile. Eric Donovan was exactly the type of person Mark had imagined. Wealthy, arrogant, and untouchable. He owned a real estate firm in the city, frequently posting pictures of expensive cars, luxury vacations, and high-profile parties. His Instagram account was a parade of opulence, filled with captions like "living the dream" and "work hard, play harder." But there was one detail that struck Mark the hardest. Eric was married. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. While Mark's life had been falling apart, Eric was living a double life, keeping his wife and Rachel in separate worlds. It made Mark's blood boil. Eric had ruined Mark's marriage without a second thought, and now Mark was going to make sure his perfect little world crumbled too. After some deliberation, Mark decided to reach out to Eric's wife, a woman named Claire. He found her profile online, a polished, poised woman who appeared to be Eric's counterpart in every way. He sent her a message, keeping it brief but pointed. "Hi Claire. I don't know if you're aware, but your husband Eric has been having an affair with my wife, Rachel. I have proof, and I think you deserve to know the truth. Please let me know if you'd like to talk." It didn't take long for Claire to respond. "I'm going to need to see this proof. If this is true, we have a lot to discuss." Mark sent her screenshots of the messages and photos he had found on Rachel's phone. Claire's reply came quickly. "Thank you for telling me. I knew something was going on, but I didn't know who she was. Can we meet?" Mark met Claire at a quiet coffee shop downtown. She was composed but visibly upset, her fingers clutching her coffee cup as if it were the only thing grounding her. "I don't even know where to start," she said after they exchanged introductions. "I've suspected for months, but I didn't have proof until now." "Same here," Mark admitted. "I only found out a few days ago." Claire shook her head, her jaw tightening. Eric always thought he was too smart to get caught. He's been doing this for years. Different women, same excuses. Mark frowned. "Years?" Rachel made it sound like this was the only time. "It never is," Claire said bitterly. They spent the next hour comparing notes, piecing together the timeline of Eric and Rachel's affair. The more they talked, the clearer it became that Eric had orchestrated the entire thing, preying on Rachel during business meetings and manipulating her with his charm and money. By the end of the conversation, Claire looked at Mark with determination. "He thinks he can do whatever he wants and get away with it. But not this time." Mark nodded. "I'm with you. Let's make him regret this." Mark and Claire devised a plan to expose Eric. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about holding him accountable for the damage he had caused. Claire would confront Eric in public, using the evidence Mark had provided. She planned to do it at one of his company's networking events, ensuring that his colleagues and clients would witness the fallout. Meanwhile, Mark decided to confront Rachel one final time. He needed closure, but he also wanted her to know just how far her choices had rippled. Mark called Rachel and asked her to meet him at a park near their home. She agreed, her voice hesitant but hopeful. When she arrived, she looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "Mark, thank you for meeting me," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he replied. They sat on a bench, the cool autumn air heavy with tension. "I know about Eric," Mark began. "I know he's married." "Did you?" Rachel's face went pale. "What? No, I didn't know." "Don't lie to me," Mark said sharply. "Did you know he had a wife?" Rachel hesitated, then nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I found out a few weeks ago. I wanted to end it, but he said he was going to leave her for me." Mark laughed bitterly. "Of course he did. And you believed him?" "I was stupid," Rachel whispered. "I thought he cared about me." "He doesn't care about you, Rachel," Mark said, his voice cold. "You were just a distraction to him. And now, because of you, my life is in pieces." "I'm so sorry," Rachel sobbed. "I don't know how to fix this." "You can't fix it," Mark said, standing. "But Eric? He's about to learn what happens when you destroy people's lives." The air was thick with anticipation. Everything Mark and Claire had planned was about to come to a head, and there was no turning back. Eric's networking event was the perfect setting, a sleek, high-profile gathering at a luxury hotel filled with colleagues, clients, and acquaintances. It was his domain, a place where he thrived on admiration and respect. But tonight, it would become the stage for his humiliation. Mark didn't attend the event. This was Claire's part to play. She entered the ballroom dressed impeccably, a sharp contrast to the turmoil she felt inside. For years, she had been the dutiful wife, supporting Eric's career while ignoring the growing signs of his infidelity. But tonight, she was taking control. Eric spotted her across the room, his confident smile faltering when he saw her expression. She didn't approach him immediately, instead weaving through the crowd, greeting familiar faces and subtly ensuring that as many people as possible were paying attention. When the moment was right, Claire approached Eric, her voice loud enough to carry. "Eric, we need to talk. Right now." "Claire," he said, his tone placating, his smile strained. "Not here." "Yes, here," she shot back, pulling out her phone. "Because I want all of your friends and colleagues to know exactly who you are." The room fell silent as Claire played the recordings and displayed the screenshots Mark had provided. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Eric's messages to Rachel came into view, his promises of love and plans to leave Claire laid bare for all to see. "You thought you could keep lying to me, to everyone," Claire said, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "But your lies are over." Eric's face turned a deep shade of red as the weight of the moment crashed down on him. His colleagues whispered among themselves, their respect for him evaporating as the truth of his double life unfolded before them. Claire left the event with her head held high, knowing she had delivered the blow that would shatter Eric's carefully constructed facade. Meanwhile, Mark waited at home, scrolling through social media as the fallout from the event began to ripple outward. Posts from attendees flooded his feed, many of them recounting the dramatic confrontation in vivid detail. But his satisfaction was short-lived. There was still unfinished business, his final reckoning with Rachel. That night, Rachel came to the house. She looked defeated, her shoulders slumped and her face lined with guilt. "Mark," she began, standing in the doorway, "I just wanted to say—" "Don't," he interrupted, stepping aside to let her in. Rachel hesitated, then walked into the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch. Mark remained standing, his arms crossed. "I heard about the event," she said quietly. "Claire really did it, didn't she?" "She did," Mark replied. "And now Eric's life is falling apart, just like ours did." Rachel nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I know you hate me, Mark. I hate myself too. I destroyed everything." "You're right," Mark said, his voice cold. "You did destroy everything. And I want you to know something. There's no coming back from this. Not for us." Rachel flinched but didn't argue. "I understand," she whispered. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Then Mark spoke again, his voice softer but no less firm. "I'm selling the house. I need a clean slate, away from all of this." Rachel looked up, startled. "Selling the house? But this is our home." "It was our home," Mark corrected. "Not anymore." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. Eric's reputation in the business world was irreparably damaged. Clients withdrew their partnerships, colleagues distanced themselves, and even his own employees began resigning. Claire filed for divorce, taking a substantial portion of his wealth with her. Rachel's life, too, fell apart. The humiliation of being exposed as the other woman followed her everywhere. Friends abandoned her, whispers trailed her in public, and job opportunities evaporated as word of the scandal spread. She moved into a small apartment, far from the suburban comfort she had once enjoyed, and took a job waiting tables to make ends meet. Mark, meanwhile, sold the house and moved to a new city. He found a modest apartment and threw himself into his work, hoping that a fresh start would help him rebuild. But even as he moved forward, the scars of Rachel's betrayal lingered. Trusting others felt impossible, and the anger he had once directed at her now turned inward, leaving him isolated and guarded. Months later, Mark and Rachel crossed paths by chance at a gas station just outside of town. She was filling her car, her face thinner and her expression weary. Mark hadn't seen her since the day he told her about the house. "Mark," she said softly when their eyes met. "Rachel," he replied, his tone neutral. They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Rachel spoke. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything." Mark nodded. I know you are. I hope you're doing okay, she added. I'm trying, he said simply. What about you? Rachel let out a bitter laugh. I'm surviving. Barely. Mark didn't respond, and after a moment, Rachel sighed. I hope you find happiness again, Mark. You deserve it. Take care of yourself, Rachel, he said, walking back to his car. As he drove away, Mark felt a pang of emotion, pity, sadness, maybe even the faintest trace of forgiveness. But it was fleeting, like a shadow passing over him before disappearing into the distance. Ruined lives. Mark and Rachel's lives, once intertwined, were now fragmented and broken. Both carried the weight of their choices, Rachel with her guilt and shame, Mark with his bitterness and loss. Neither of them found peace, only the hollow remains of what once was. And in the end, the scars left by betrayal were the only things they truly shared. Thank you for listening to the story to the end. Please like, share your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel.